The first sound was a lie. Not the distant rhythmic thunder of hooves, for that was real enough, but the delicate chime of the bell above the bank door. It was a sound of polite commerce, of civilized transaction, a promise of order in a world carved from chaos. Jacob Pierce, standing across the street in the searing heat of his smithy, heard it and thought nothing of it. He was hammering a horseshoe, the clang of steel on steel, a more honest music for this land, a rhythm of sweat and toil that left no room for deceit. Then the lie was shattered along with the bank's front window. Glass exploded outward in a crystalline spray, catching the noon sun in 1,000 fleeting stars. A woman's scream, thin and sharp, was swallowed by the sudden roar of men and the panicked shrieking of horses. Harmony Creek, a town that existed in a perpetual state of dusty slumber, was violently, brutally awake. Jacob's hammer fell silent. He stood frozen, the half-finished shoe glowing cherry red in his tongs. Through the swirling dust kicked up by a dozen shod hooves, he saw them riders, their faces obscured by trail-worn bandanas, their movements a blur of practiced violence. They moved with the brutal efficiency of a wolf pack, 2 guarding the street, 3 storming the bank, their pistols barking commands that were punctuated by the terrified sobs of the people inside. Panic rippled through the street. Merchants dove back into their shops, shutters slamming down like guillotines. The air moments before thick with the scent of baking bread and hot metal now tasted of gunpowder and fear. Jacob's first instinct was to retreat, to seek the familiar shelter of his forge, the one place where the world made sense. He was a blacksmith, a mender of things, not a fighter. His hands were skilled at shaping iron, not wielding iron that spat fire. But then he saw the horse. The lead rider, a tall, commanding figure who sat his black stallion not as a man on a beast, but as a king on a throne, dismounted with a fluid grace that was terrifying in its confidence. He alone wore no mask. His face was lean-framed by dark hair, and his eyes scanned the street with an unnerving calm. He wasn't just here for money. This was something else. Jacob felt a cold dread snake up his spine. He knew with a certainty that defied logic that this man was the heart of the storm. As the outlaws inside the bank herded a weeping Mr. Abernathy, the bank manager, out onto the porch, the leader ignored them. His gaze swept past the saloon, past the general store, and settled with chilling precision on the open doors of the smithy. On Jacob. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. The noise of the robbery faded into a dull roar, and the chaos of the street a distant backdrop. The man's eyes were a pale, piercing blue, as cold and final as a newly dug grave. There was a flicker of recognition in them, a dark fire that had been banked for a very long time. One of the robbers emerged from the bank canvas sacks, heavy with the town's future slung over his shoulder. "We got it, Silas. All of it." The leader, Silas, did not look away from Jacob. He gave a curt nod, his attention still locked on the blacksmith. He started across the street, his spurs ringing a death knell on the hard-packed earth. He moved not with the swagger of a common outlaw, but with the deliberate, inexorable purpose of a hawk descending on its prey. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't possible. No one knew him here. He had come to Harmony Creek 5 years ago to bury his past, to become a ghost. He was Jacob Pierce, the quiet blacksmith, a man whose history began and ended at the town line. Silas stopped just before him, the shadow of his tall frame falling over Jacob. He smelled of leather, sweat, and the high, lonesome desert. Up close, his charisma was a palpable force, a dangerous magnetism that drew you in, even as every instinct screamed to run. Jacob Pierce Silas set his voice a low, cultured baritone that was horribly out of place. It was the voice of an educated man, a man who read books. "It has been a long time." Jacob's throat was a knot of dust. I don't know you." A cruel smile touched Silas's lips. "Oh, I think you do. You just don't know that you know." He gestured vaguely toward the chaos at the bank. "This is just business. A bit of noise to secure a private transaction." His gaze dropped to the fine silver chain, visible at the collar of Jacob's sweat-stained shirt. With a flick of his wrist, faster than a snake's strike, he reached out and tore the chain from Jacob's neck. Jacob gasped a sound of pure, unthinking agony. In Silas's gloved hand lay a small silver locket tarnished with age and smoothed by the touch of Jacob's thumb over countless lonely nights. It was all he had left of her. Of Eleanor. No, Jacob whispered the word, a raw plea. Please, take anything else. Silas examined the locket, his expression unreadable. He didn't open it. He simply held it as if weighing the soul of the man before him. This is what I came for, he said softly. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was for Jacob alone. Consider it a down payment. A debt is being paid, blacksmith, for what was stolen in the Black Hills. The Black Hills. The word struck Jacob like a physical blow, a ghost from a grave he had spent 5 years digging. His blood ran cold. Silas straightened up, slipping the locket into his vest pocket. He turned his back to Jacob and swung himself onto his stallion in one seamless motion. Ride! He commanded, his voice now a whip crack that cut through the air. The gang wheeled their horses, firing a final defiant volley into the sky. They thundered out of town, a whirlwind of dust and stolen hope, leaving behind a shattered window, a looted vault, and a silence that was heavier and more profound than any sound. Jacob stood unmoving, his hand clutching the empty space on his chest where the locket used to be. The heat from the forge felt like ice against his skin. The money was gone. The town's dream of an aqueduct, of a future free from the tyranny of the sun, was gone. But for Jacob, all of that was secondary. Silas hadn't just stolen a piece of silver. He had stolen the last tangible piece of his wife, and in doing so, he had resurrected a past Jacob had prayed was dead and buried. The debt, he had said. A debt being paid. For the first time in 5 years, the ghost of what he had done in the Black Hills was no longer just a nightmare. It was here, and it had a name. Silas. The dust settled slowly, revealing the tableau of Harmony Creek's violation. Sheriff Brody emerged from his office, his face a grim mask of weariness. He was a man built of solid, dependable lines, his shoulders stooped not by age, but by the accumulated weight of other people's troubles. At his side, his young deputy Finn looked pale and shaken, his hand hovering near the pistol he hadn't had time to draw. Anyone hurt? Brody's voice was gravelly, the sound of a man who had seen this brand of ugliness too many times before. Mr. Abernathy, the bank manager, sat on the steps, his head in his hands. They're ruined us, Sheriff. Ruined. The aqueduct fund, everything. The townsfolk gathered in a hushed, fearful cluster. Their hopes had resided in that vault, a shared dream of irrigation ditches that would turn their parched lands green. Now that dream lay in the dust, with the shattered glass. Brody's gaze swept over the scene, methodical and grim. He noted the hoof prints, the discarded shell casings, the direction of the outlaw's flight. His eyes finally landed on Jacob, who still stood like a statue before his smithy. Jacob, you all right? Brody asked, walking over. Did they take anything from you? Jacob looked at the sheriff, his eyes hollow. He took my wife's locket. Brody's expression softened with a flicker of pity. I'm sorry to hear that, son. They were professionals. Clean and fast. He put a hand on Jacob's shoulder. We'll form a posse. We'll get the money back. Maybe the locket too. But Jacob knew better. This wasn't a simple robbery. The way Silas had looked at him, the specificity of his words. The Black Hills. It was a message written in a language no one else in this town could understand. Over the next hour, the town buzzed with a frantic, impotent energy. A posse was indeed formed, a collection of grim-faced ranchers and shopkeepers whose anger was a thin veneer over their fear. They rode out with a great show of determination, following the tracks that led east into the labyrinthine canyons of the Badlands. Jacob returned to the cold silence of his forge. The horseshoe he'd been working on lay on the anvil, a dull graying crescent. He didn't touch it. Instead, he went to the small living quarters at the back, a single room furnished with a bed, a table, and a wooden chest. From the chest, he pulled a worn leather satchel. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were a Colt peacemaker and a box of cartridges. He hadn't touched them since the day he'd arrived in Harmony Creek. He had come here to be a blacksmith, to build, not to destroy. But Silas had changed that. That night, sleep offered no escape. Jacob was back in the darkness of the Black Creek mine, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and blasting powder. He heard the rumble, the sickening crack of timbers splintering under an impossible weight. He saw a man's face, not Silas's, but younger, with the same pale eyes, mouth open in a silent scream before the world caved in. He always woke up at that moment, his own throat raw from a cry that never left his lips, the phantom weight of rock and earth, pressing down on him, the guilt and eternal suffocation. This time, however, when he woke drenched in sweat, a new face was superimposed over the memory Silas's, his smile cold and cruel, whispering, "A debt is being paid." The posse returned 2 days later, their horses lame, their faces etched with failure. They had lost the trail in the rock-strewn maze of the Cimarron canyons. The outlaws, Sheriff Brody reported grimly, had scattered like quail, their tracks vanishing as if they had been ghosts all along. "The trail's cold," Jacob Brody said, finding him by the forge. The fire was out. Jacob hadn't lit it since the robbery. "They're long gone. Could be in Mexico by now. We have to accept it. The money is gone." Brody sighed, his gaze drifting toward the parched fields beyond the town. "We'll survive. We always do." He noticed the distant look in Jacob's eyes. "I know the locket meant the world to you, but it's just a thing, son. You have to let it go." Jacob looked at the sheriff, a man he respected, a man who saw the world in clear lines of right and wrong, law and chaos. But Brody couldn't see the shadow that stretched all the way from the Black Hills to this small, forgotten town. He couldn't understand that the locket wasn't just a thing. It was a vessel for a memory, a promise, and now a piece of a puzzle he had to solve or be consumed by. "I can't," Jacob said, his voice quiet but firm. That evening, as twilight painted the mesas in bruised shades of purple and orange, Jacob packed his saddlebags. He took Jerky a canteen of water and the gun he'd sworn he would never use again. He saddled his mare, a sturdy buckskin that knew the harshness of the trail. He wasn't a lawman or a bounty hunter. He was a blacksmith, a quiet man pushed too far. But he was also the only one who knew that this wasn't about the town's money. It was a reckoning, and it had been 5 years in the coming. He rode east alone, a solitary figure moving toward the rising moon, following a trail not of hoofprints, but of a ghost from his past. The Badlands were a testament to God's fury. Jagged spires of sun-baked rock clawed at a mercilessly blue sky, and the ground was a cracked, thirsty mosaic of dried mud and alkali dust. The sun beat down with a physical weight, making the air shimmer like a phantom river, promising relief that was only a mirage. For 3 days Jacob rode through this unforgiving landscape, his world shrinking to the creak of saddle leather, the rhythmic plodding of his mare and the grit of sand between his teeth. He was a patient man, a trait honed by the slow, deliberate work of the forge. He knew how to read the land, to see the subtle signs others missed. A freshly turned stone, a broken branch on a creosote bush, the faintest scuff of a boot heel in the sand. Silas's gang had scattered, but they were men, not spirits. They had to be heading somewhere. They had to drink. He followed the thin, life-giving veins of dried-up creek beds, betting that Silas would lead his men toward the next water source. A remote spring known only to those who had spent time in this desolation. His survival skills learned in a life before Harmony Creek returned to him like a second skin. He rationed his water, chewing on a pebble to keep his mouth from turning to dust. He navigated by the sun and stars, his internal compass as true as ever. But the land tested him. On the fourth day, as he guided his horse along a narrow ledge path, the ground gave a low groan. Rocks and scree loosened by the endless cycle of heat, and cold cascaded down the cliff face. His mare screamed, rearing in terror. Jacob threw himself from the saddle, landing hard on the unforgiving rock as tons of debris thundered past where he had been moments before. He lay there, his shoulder throbbing, the sound of the rock slide echoing through the canyon, a stark reminder of his own fragility. He was alone. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and the desert would claim him without a whisper. He pressed on, his resolve hardening with every obstacle. The pursuit was no longer just about the locket. It was a pilgrimage into his own past. With every mile, the carefully constructed walls around his memory of the Black Creek mine began to crumble. He had told himself it was an accident, a tragedy born of geology and bad luck. But was it? Had he missed something? Had his own fear and grief blinded him to another truth? It was near dusk on the fifth day when he found it. Vultures circled lazily in the heat-hazed sky, a grim semaphore that led him to a narrow arroyo. There, sprawled in the shade of an overhang, was the body of a man. He was one of Silas's gang, his face a mask of dried blood and dust, a single neat hole in his back. His horse was gone, his canteen empty. Jacob searched his pockets. There was nothing of value save for a crumpled, sweat-stained piece of paper. It was a wanted poster. The ink was faded, the drawing crude, but the name was clear. Silas Kane, wanted for robbery and murder. $500 reward. Jacob stared at the name. Kane. The name felt significant, a bell tolling in the back of his mind. He had heard the gang member call him Silas, but this surname, it was another piece of the puzzle. Why would one of Silas's men be carrying this? Was it a warning? A trophy? Or had Silas dropped it? He folded the poster and tucked it away. He looked at the dead man left behind for being wounded, or simply for slowing the group down. It was a chilling testament to Silas's ruthlessness. There was no honor among these thieves, only a cold, predatory pragmatism. Jacob said no prayer for the dead man. He simply took the man's remaining jerky, refilled his canteen from a small muddy seep he found nearby, and continued his journey. The image of the wanted poster burned into his mind. 2 days later, the landscape began to soften. The brutal rock gave way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and sagebrush that shimmered silver in the moonlight. He was nearing the edge of the Badlands, approaching the territory patrolled by federal law. It was here, at a dusty crossroads, with a single creaking signpost, that he met him. The man was tall and wiry, with a face that looked like it had been carved from old leather and left out in the sun. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his eyes, and a U.S. Marshal's star was pinned to his dusty vest. He sat on a powerful gray gelding, a rifle resting across his lap, watching Jacob approach with an air of absolute stillness. "That's far enough," the marshal said, his voice dry as the dust underfoot. Jacob reined in his mare. "I'm just passing through." "Nobody just passes through here," the marshal countered. "This is the end of the line. You're either running from something or hunting something. Judging by the look of you, I'd say it's the latter." He nudged his horse forward, his eyes taking in Jacob's worn-out state, the grim set of his jaw, and the butt of the Colt Peacemaker visible under his coat. "Who are you trailing?" Jacob hesitated. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to keeping his own counsel. Trust was a currency he no longer possessed. But there was something in the marshal's steady, unblinking gaze, not suspicion, but a deep, professional curiosity. And Jacob knew he couldn't do this alone forever. Silas was too smart, too ruthless. A man named Silas Jacob said, He and his gang robbed the bank in Harmony Creek. The marshal's eyebrow twitched. Silas. Tall man rides. A black stallion talks like a preacher quoting scripture. That's him. Silas Vance, the marshal corrected him. That's the name he uses anyway. I'm Marshal Thorne, and I've been hunting Mr. Vance for the better part of a year, across 3 territories. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He's a ghost. Hits a place and vanishes. But you managed to track him through the Cimarron. Either you're the luckiest man alive, or you know something I don't. Jacob reached into his pocket and produced the wanted poster. I found this on one of his men. The name on it is Silas Kane. Thorne took the poster, his eyes narrowing as he read it. Kane. I'll be damned. He looked from the poster back to Jacob. That might explain a few things. A man on the run often sheds his skin name included. But why are you after him? A blacksmith doesn't usually chase a man like Silas over a town's stolen money. He took something of mine. Jacob said, his voice low. Something personal. Thorne studied him for a long moment, a silent assessment of character and motive. Silas Vance, or Kane, or whatever he calls himself, isn't just a bank robber. His trail is littered with oddities. A burned-out assay office in Colorado, a freight company run into the ground in Wyoming. On the surface, they look like crimes of opportunity. But when you dig deeper, you find a connection. Every target, every life he's ruined, has a link back to one place, the Black Hills Consolidated Mining Company, circa 1868. Jacob felt the blood drain from his face. Thorne saw the reaction, his sharp eyes missing nothing. It seems, the marshal said, a dawning understanding in his voice, that you and I are hunting the same man for very different reasons. He's erasing a history, Mr. Pierce. And it appears you're the last chapter. A reluctant alliance was forged in the dust of that lonely crossroads. Thorne, the cynical lawman, and Jacob, the haunted blacksmith, 2 men bound by a common enemy. Together, they rode on not just in pursuit of a man, but in pursuit of a truth that lay buried under 5 years of silence and a mountain of rock. Their partnership was a thing of grit and silence. Thorne was a man of procedure and facts, piecing together Silas's movements from telegrams, old reports, and the whispers of informants. Jacob was the tracker, the one who could read the land and sense the predator's path. They were 2 halves of a whole, and their combined expertise began to tighten the net around Silas Vance. They stopped in dusty, fly-blown towns, Thorne showing the wanted poster for Silas Kane, while Jacob listened in saloons and stables. A pattern began to emerge. The stories were always the same. A charming, well-spoken stranger would arrive, stay for a few weeks, and then leave, just as a local business collapsed in ruin of fire. A mysteriously spooked herd, a doctored ledger. And each ruined business, as Thorne had suspected, was owned by a man who had once worked for or invested in the Black Hills Consolidated Mining Company. Silas wasn't just committing crimes. He was systematically dismantling the lives of everyone associated with that long-defunct enterprise. He was salting the earth of Jacob's past. He's not just erasing history, Jacob said one night as they sat by a meager campfire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. He's working his way toward me. These other men, they were just stops along the way. Thorne nodded, cleaning his rifle with meticulous care. He's making you watch. Wants you to know he's coming. It's a special kind of cruelty. He paused, looking at Jacob over the flickering light. You never told me what happened back there. In the Black Hills. Jacob stared into the fire, the memories he'd suppressed for so long now, bubbling to the surface. I was the foreman. Black Creek Mine. We were following a promising vein of silver. The work was dangerous, the ground unstable. We had shoring timbers, safety protocols, but you can't account for everything. His voice grew quiet, distant. There was a cave-in. A support beam snapped. I was near the entrance. Another man, a young geologist named William. He was deeper in. The whole tunnel collapsed. It took us a week to dig him out. He was gone. An accident, Thorne stated, his tone neutral. That's what the inquiry ruled, Jacob said. But his own voice lacked conviction. He could still feel the tremor, hear the groan of the earth, see the dust and chaos. And he could still see the look of terror on William's face. I left right after. Couldn't stand the sight of that mountain another day. I took what savings I had and I just disappeared. Came to Harmony Creek to start over. To be someone else. Thorne was silent for a time, letting the confession hang in the cool night air. This William, he finally asked. What was his last name? The question was like a key turning in a lock Jacob hadn't known was there. He thought back, dredging up a detail he hadn't considered in 5 years. I think it was Kane. William Kane. The two men looked at each other. The wanted poster. Silas Kane. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a coffin lid closing. Silas wasn't just some outlaw with a grudge against a mining company. He was William's brother. Their pursuit intensified. They learned Silas's gang was holed up in the rocky foothills to the north, resting their horses and planning their next move. Thorne devised a plan to corner them in a box canyon. But they needed to isolate one of the gang members first to learn their exact location. They got their chance a few days later, spotting a lone rider leaving the gang's hidden camp, likely heading for a nearby town for supplies. They tracked him for hours, finally cornering him in an old line shack, a dilapidated structure miles from anywhere. The confrontation was swift and brutal. The outlaw, a wiry man with shifty eyes, tried to draw, but Thorne was faster, his pistol appearing in his hand, as if by magic. A single shot sent the outlaw's gun spinning into the dirt. They dragged him inside the shack, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Thorne was all business, his questions sharp and direct. The man was defiant, spitting curses. "We can do this the easy way," Thorne said, his voice dangerously calm, "or I can leave you tied up in here for the buzzards. Your choice." The outlaw's bravado began to crack. He looked from Thorne's stony face to Jacob's haunted eyes. He saw no mercy in either man. "What does he want with me?" Jacob demanded, his voice raw. He grabbed the man by the collar. "Why is he doing this?" The outlaw laughed, a broken, desperate sound. He talks about you all the time. He don't care about the money, not really. This is all for you." The man's eyes gleamed with a crazed light. "He calls you the Butcher of Black Creek. Says you murdered his brother for a silver claim. He says you collapsed that mine on purpose to bury him in your crime. This ain't a robbery, friend. This is a debt of blood. And he's come to collect." The words slammed into Jacob with the force of a physical blow. A murderer. The word echoed in the silent shack, twisting the tragic accident that had defined his life into a monstrous act of malice. He staggered back, his carefully constructed reality shattering around him. He had run from a tragedy, but Silas had spent 5 years nursing a story of betrayal, twisting his grief into a righteous, all-consuming quest for vengeance. The pursuit was no longer about a locket or a town's money. It was about 2 versions of the past, set to collide with the force of an avalanche. And Jacob knew with a chilling certainty that Silas wouldn't stop until one of them was buried for good. The revelation in the line shack changed everything. The air grew colder, the sky more vast and empty. Jacob rode beside Thorne, but he was adrift in a sea of his own. Past and the outlaw's words echoing in his mind. Butcher of Black Creek. The title was a brand seared into his soul. Silas hadn't just invented a story. He had unearthed Jacob's deepest, most secret fear that somehow, in some way he couldn't name, He truly was responsible for William Kane's death. Their prisoner, broken and terrified, had given up the location of Silas's camp, a series of caves hidden in a formation of rock known as the Devil's Teeth. Thorn formulated a plan. They would wait until nightfall, use the darkness to get close and take the gang by surprise. But Silas was always one step ahead. It was as if he could sense their intentions, as if their hunt had become a shared, intimate dance. As they crested a ridge overlooking the valley where the caves were hidden, and they saw not a camp preparing for the night, but the last of Silas's riders disappearing over a distant rise. A single horse remained tied to a scrub brush near the cave mouth. "It's a trap," Thorn said, his voice flat. Jacob felt a cold knot of dread. He knew we were coming. They approached cautiously. Tied to the saddle of the remaining horse was a canvas pouch. Inside was not a message, but a fresh horseshoe one Jacob recognized. It bore his specific maker's mark, a small, stylized P integrated into the curve. It was one of the shoes he had been making the day of the robbery. Silas was toying with him, leaving him a piece of his own life as a calling card. A rider appeared on the horizon, galloping hard toward them. He wasn't one of Silas's men. He was a ranch hand from the valley, his face pale with terror. "Marshal." He gasped, reining his horse to a skidding halt. "It's the town redemption." A gang of riders took the whole town hostage. They got everyone, women, children, rounded them up in the church. Thorn and Jacob exchanged a grim look. The leader, the ranch hand, stammered, "He sent me. He said to find the marshal and the blacksmith who's with him. He says the blacksmith has to meet him, alone, in the saloon at sunset. If he's not there, he's going to start." The man couldn't finish the sentence. He just shook his head, his eyes wide with horror. Silas had changed the game. He had grown tired of the chase, of the slow, methodical destruction of Jacob's past. Now he was taking aim at the present, holding innocent lives in the balance. He was forcing the final confrontation on his terms, in a place of his choosing. As if on cue, the wind began to shift. A strange yellow-brown haze appeared on the western horizon, a roiling wall of dust that was steadily swallowing the sky. Sandstorm Thorn muttered, his eyes on the approaching tempest. "A bad one. By the time we get to Redemption, the whole valley will be socked in. No way in or out." The ride to Redemption was a frantic race against the dying light and the encroaching storm. The wind howled around them, whipping sand into their faces until it felt like 1,000 tiny needles against their skin. The sun, a weak, blood-orange disk, was slowly being devoured by the churning clouds of dust. They reached the outskirts of the town just as the storm hit in full force. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of brown fury. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at roofs and rattling windows. The town of Redemption was cut off from the world, a ship trapped in a furious earthen sea. Through the gale, they could make out the town's layout. The church stood on a small rise at one end, its windows ominously dark. At the other end was the saloon, a few of its lanterns casting a sickly, defiant glow that was barely visible through the thick haze. In between was a ghost town, its streets empty, scoured by the wind. "He's got us," Thorn yelled over the roar of the storm. "He's penned us in. I can't risk my men storming the church in this. We'd be shooting blind, and I can't let you go in there alone." "You don't have a choice," Jacob yelled back, his voice raw. "This isn't about your law, Thorn. It never was. It's about me and him. Those people in the church, their lives are on my head. A debt is being paid, remember? It seems I'm not the only one with a bill to settle." He looked at the saloon, its faint light a beacon in the tempest. It was a stage, and Silas had set it perfectly. The howling storm, the imprisoned town, the ticking clock of sunset, it was all part of his theatrical, cruel design. Jacob dismounted, pulling his jacket tight against the gale. He checked his Colt, the metal cold and heavy in his hand. He was no longer just a blacksmith. The heat of the forge had been replaced by an icy resolve. He had run from the Black Hills to escape his guilt. He had chased Silas across the Badlands to reclaim his past. Now he had to walk into that saloon to face the truth, whatever it might be. He gave Thorne a final hard look, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey, and then he turned and walked into the storm, toward the pale, wavering light of the saloon, to keep his appointment with the ghost who called him a murderer. The saloon door swung open with a groan, protesting the wind that forced its way in with Jacob. A whirlwind of dust and sand swirled across the floorboards, momentarily obscuring the figure standing at the far end of the bar. The storm outside was a physical presence inside a constant howling roar that made the silence in the room feel heavy and profound. Dust seeped through the walls, coating everything in a fine, gritty powder. The air was thick, and a lone lantern on the bar cast long, distorted shadows that writhed like living things. Silas stood there, a glass of whiskey in one hand, looking as calm and immaculate as if he were in a fine city establishment. He was alone, but tied to a chair in the center of the room, gagged and pale, was Sheriff Brody. He must have ridden ahead to Harmony Creek, a prize hostage to ensure Jacob's compliance. His eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fury followed Jacob's every move. Right on time, blacksmith Silas said, his voice cutting cleanly through the storm's chaos. He gestured with his glass toward the room. "Welcome. I had this stage prepared especially for you. A fitting backdrop for our final act, don't you think? A world coming apart at the seams." Jacob's hand hovered over the butt of his Colt. "Let him go, Silas. This is between us." All in due time, Silas replied with a chilling smile. He took a sip of his whiskey. "First, I want you to hear it. The story. Not the one you've been telling yourself for 5 years in your dusty little hideaway. The real story." He set his glass down and began to pace his movements, measured and theatrical. "My brother William was a dreamer. He saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. He saw veins of silver where others saw only rock. He trusted people. His biggest mistake was trusting you." Silas stopped and turned his eyes, locking onto Jacob's. "He wrote to me, you know. In his last letter, he was excited. He'd found a new deposit richer than any before. A deposit he said you were trying to push him away from. He said you were jealous that you wanted the claim for yourself. He was scared. He said you'd been tampering with the support beams, blaming it on ground instability." Every word was a hammer blow reshaping Jacob's memory. He remembered arguing with William, yes. The young geologist had been reckless, wanting to blast deeper into a notoriously unstable section of the mine against Jacob's direct orders. Was that the deposit Silas was talking about? Had William twisted Jacob's caution into something sinister in his letters? "That's a lie," Jacob said, his voice hoarse. "He was being reckless. I was trying to protect him." "Protect him." Silas scoffed, his voice rising with a sudden passionate fury. "You murdered him. You saw your chance and you took it. You weakened the main support, triggered the collapse, and buried him under a mountain of rock and lies. You killed my brother and stole his future, all for a pocketful of silver." The conviction in his voice was absolute. He believed it. Every word. For 5 years, this version of the story had been his fuel, his religion. Jacob felt his own certainty waver under the sheer force of Silas's grief. The guilt that had haunted his nightmares for years surged, overwhelming him. What if Silas was right? What if in his anger and frustration with the boy's recklessness, he had overlooked something, made a mistake that cost a life? "He was my brother Silas," whispered his voice, cracking with a pain that was terrifyingly real. "And you erased him. So I decided to erase you. Your company, your friends, your new life. and finally the last thing you hold dear. He reached into his vest and pulled out the silver locket, dangling it from its broken chain. This, a memory of a dead wife. A fitting trade for the memory of a dead brother. In that moment, something inside Jacob snapped. The grief, the guilt, the fear, it all coalesced into a single blinding point of rage. It wasn't about who was right or wrong anymore. It was about that locket. It was about Eleanor. Jacob lunged. He didn't draw his gun. This was too personal for that. He crashed into Silas, sending them both staggering back. The locket flew from Silas's grasp, skittering across the dusty floor. The fight was a desperate, clumsy brawl fueled by years of pain. They crashed over tables, the sound of splintering wood lost in the storm's roar. Silas was wiry and fast, but Jacob had the brute strength of a blacksmith. He landed a heavy punch to Silas's jaw, sending him stumbling back against the bar. Jacob scrambled on the floor, his hands searching for the locket. His fingers brushed against the cool metal. He snatched it up just as Silas recovered, drawing his pistol. "It's over," Silas hissed, leveling the gun at Jacob's chest. Jacob knelt on the floor, clutching the locket in his fist. His heart pounded. This was it. The end of the story. His thumb, acting on pure instinct, pressed the small clasp. The locket sprang open. He expected to see the tiny, faded portrait of Eleanor, her gentle smile, a balm to his soul. But the picture was gone. In its place, tucked into the tiny frame, was a small folded piece of yellowed paper. His hands trembling, he pulled it out and unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, hurried. It was a letter, or a part of one addressed to a name Jacob didn't recognize. "The foreman, Pierce, is holding me back. He suspects. I told him the timbers were weak, but he won't listen. The plan is set for tomorrow. A small charge near the main support, just enough to trigger a minor collapse and seal the old tunnel. The company will call it an accident, and our rivals at Keystone will pay me what they promised for sabotaging the survey. I just need to make sure I'm clear before it goes." It was signed William Kane. Jacob stared at the paper, the words blurring through the sudden rush of tears in his eyes. It was a confession. A confession he had been carrying over his heart for 5 years, completely unaware. William hadn't been a dreamer. He had been a criminal. The accident was a deliberate act of sabotage that had gone wrong. William Kane hadn't been murdered. He had been killed by his own greed. Slowly, Jacob got to his feet. He held out the fragile piece of paper. Silas stared at him, his pistol unwavering, his face a mask of confusion. "You talk of lies," Silas, Jacob said, his voice shaking but clear. "You've spent 5 years building your life on the biggest lie of all." He took a step forward, holding out the confession. "Your brother wasn't a victim. He was a saboteur. He did this to himself." Silas's eyes flickered down to the note. He saw his brother's handwriting. He read the damning words. The gun in his hand began to tremble. His face, a moment before so full of righteous fury, seemed to crumble. The hatred, the certainty, the entire purpose that had driven him across 3 territories evaporated in an instant, leaving behind only a hollow, gaping void. The storm inside him fell silent, and all that was left was the howling of the wind outside. The gunfight was over, replaced by a battle far more profound, a confrontation between a vengeance built on lies and a truth that offered no comfort. The storm broke as suddenly as it had arrived. The relentless screaming wind died down to a mournful sigh, and through the dust-choked windows of the saloon, the first rays of a setting sun pierced the gloom, casting long golden shafts of light across the scene of quiet devastation. The saloon door burst open, and Marshal Thorne stormed in. His men fanned out behind him, rifles at the ready. They found a scene of frozen tension. Jacob stood holding the small yellowed confession, his face a canvas of exhaustion and sorrowful vindication. Across from him, Silas was on his knees, his pistol lying on the floor beside him. He stared at the note in Jacob's hand, his entire being seeming to have collapsed inward. He was no longer a fearsome outlaw leader, but a man shattered by the truth his life's quest revealed as a hollow, tragic mistake. In the center of the room, Sheriff Brody watched them both. His gag now removed his expression, one of weary disbelief. "It's over, Thorne," Jacob said, his voice barely a whisper. He held out the confession. "It's all here." Thorne took the paper, his sharp eyes scanning the contents quickly. He looked from the note to the broken man on the floor, and a flicker of something that might have been pity crossed his stoic face. He nodded to his deputies. "Take him." They lifted Silas to his feet. He offered no resistance. He moved like a sleepwalker, his eyes vacant, the fire that had driven him for so long completely extinguished. As they led him out into the clearing dust-filled twilight, the people of redemption began to emerge from the church, their faces blinking in the strange post-storm light. They saw the captured outlaws, the armed lawmen, and they understood that the nightmare was over. Back in Harmony Creek, a week later, life was slowly returning to its familiar rhythm. Most of the stolen money had been recovered from Silas's camp. The town council, led by a grateful Mr. Abernathy, announced that construction on the aqueduct would begin immediately. A palpable sense of hope so recently stolen began to settle back over the town. Jacob stood with Sheriff Brody on the boardwalk, watching a wagon loaded with lumber rumble down the main street. "I owe you an apology," Jacob Brody said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I told you it was just a trinket. I didn't understand." Jacob touched his chest where the locket used to hang. The space felt strangely light. "You had no way of knowing, Sheriff. Neither did I. Thorne telegraphed this morning." Brody continued. Silas Kane, I should say, confessed to everything. He didn't even ask for a lawyer. Seems the truth broke him more than any prison cell could." Brody shook his head. To build a whole life around that kind of hate, and for it to be for nothing. A new respect had formed between the two men, forged in the crucible of violence and revelation. Brody saw not just a quiet blacksmith, but a man of deep resolve. And Jacob saw not just a town lawman, but a pillar of decency in a world that often lacked it. "What will you do now?" Brody asked. Jacob looked toward his smithy, where the forge waited cold and silent. "I think," he said with a hint of a smile, "I have a horseshoe to finish." Months passed. The fierce heat of summer gave way to the gentle warmth of a long autumn. Harmony Creek thrived. The aqueduct, a testament to the town's resilience, was nearly complete, its wooden frame stretching like a great spine toward the thirsty fields. The sound of hammers on wood and steel became the town's new heartbeat, a rhythm of construction and renewal. Jacob was a changed man. The haunted solitary shell had fallen away, revealing the person underneath. He still worked his forge, his hammer falls a familiar and comforting sound. But he was no longer a recluse. He shared evening meals with Sheriff Brody, helped the ranchers mend their equipment, and even taught young Finn how to properly shoe a horse. The townsfolk who had once seen him as a quiet, sorrowful fixture now saw him as one of their own, a man who had faced down their demons and his own, and had emerged whole, on a clear, cool morning with the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Jacob walked to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. The grass was green, nourished by the first waters from the new aqueduct. He stopped before a simple, well-tended grave. Eleanor Pierce, beloved wife. He knelt, running his hand over the smooth, sun-warmed stone. For years his visits here had been rituals of guilt and apology. He had felt chained to this spot, to the memory of a life he had lost and another he had taken. But now the chains were gone. He reached into his pocket and took out the silver locket. He had cleaned it, and it shone brightly in the morning sun. It was empty now. The confession was with Marshal Thorne, a piece of evidence in a closed case. Eleanor's tiny portrait he had burned along with the past's suffocating power. The locket was just a locket now, a beautiful, empty vessel. "It's over, Eleanor," he whispered to the quiet stone. "The debt is paid. I'm finally free." He gently placed the empty silver locket on the headstone, leaving it to catch the light. It was a final offering, a symbolic release. He was no longer the butcher of Black Creek or the haunted blacksmith of Harmony Creek. He was just Jacob. He stood up, his gaze lingering on the grave for a moment longer, not with sadness, but with a deep and abiding peace. Then he turned his back on the hill and walked away, his shadow long before him, heading down toward the bustling town and the promise of a future he was finally ready to build.